answer. But if we focus on the American Jewish historical experience, then I think we can answer yes. Certainly, and we'll get into this a little bit, Jews have benefited in this country from appearing to be white or from their white skin. And I say that as an Ashkenazi Jew. I'm fairly white skin. And when I walk down the street or I interact with the police or I apply for a job or I apply for housing, I do so primarily as a white person, unless there is some, I'm not, I don't, unless somebody knows that I'm Jewish, just on the face of it, you wouldn't know that I'm Jewish. And in a lot of ways, over the course of history in this country, Jews have really benefited from that, from what we call white privilege, or even more sharply, the white power structures that uphold the system. For the most part, American Jews, when they arrived here as immigrants, were able to fairly quickly, in most cases, slip pretty comfortably into that white stream and to benefit from being perceived as white. A lot of the racial laws did not apply to them. Jews were never banned from marrying outside the race. They were never banned from marrying Black Americans in the way that others were. They were not subjected to the same kinds of racist laws that people of color were. Now I say that, and some of you voted no, and probably you voted no because of anti-Semitism. Look, at the end of the day, maybe we do present as white, and okay, but we all know there's anti-Semitism, and we certainly see anti-Semitism existing in history. And right now, we've had in the last few years, of course, there's been some terrible tragedies, the massacre in Pittsburgh and in California. And the fact of the matter is, Jews are the top percentage of victims for religious hate crimes in this country. And at the end of the day, you might say, well, maybe we look white, but white people at the end of the day don't consider us white. We're still Jews. We're separate. And so we don't benefit from white supremacy because at the end of the day, the white supremacists don't accept us as Jews. Now, I asked this question because it's a little bit of a trick question in that all three answers are correct. So you can rest assured whichever one you picked, you chose correctly. All three answers are correct. It really just depends on the time period, on who we're talking about, and as we're going to see, which Jews we're talking about. So which gets us into the question, well, if Jews benefit from white supremacy, well, are Jews white? And this is sort of this perennial question that comes up. And I actually feel like when I grew up, I didn't hear it that much. And now in recent years, I start hearing it a lot more, and people really, really are asking, are Jews white? Well, it depends who you ask. If you ask the right wing, the answer is no. Here we have a picture of the Charlottesville rally, the neo-Nazi rally a few years ago. Jews will not replace us. Total rejection of the idea of Jews as being in solidarity with white people. White supremacy, when it comes to Jews, is predicated on this idea that Jews are a secret cabal that's helping other minorities get rights. Historically, white supremacy has to do this kind of dance where, well, minority groups, Black people and Asian people and others are inferior to us, yet they were faced with this conundrum that Black people and Asian people and others were kept getting rights, and they were winning the civil rights movement, and gay rights were spreading around the country. And so this posed a question, well, if they're so inferior, well, then how do these groups, how are they winning these civil rights battles? And the answer that the white supremacists came up with was, well, it was the Jews. The Jews are helping them. The Jews control everything. So if you're asking a right winger, if you're asking the guy wearing the Holocaust or the Camp Auschwitz T-shirt at the Capitol building, the answer is no. Jews are not white. They're the ultimate imposters. What we've seen then on the left has been a little different, and for a lot of Jews, and I'll say for a lot of Jews, that right-wing anti-Semitism is very recognizable to us. I mean, this is going back decades. This is familiar to us from the Nazis and from the Holocaust. We're not surprised that the right-wing extremism has turned on the Jews and don't accept the Jews as part of part of America. But one thing that's been new and troubling, or a little bit new and troubling, is what's been on the left. This is a picture from, I think, France, from a rally in France after George Floyd. And it says Minneapolis, Palestine, and then there's on the bottom left there's a guy who's wearing a T-shirt that says "Boycott Israel, Apartheid." The left holds that, well, because Jews, as I said, look white and present as white, and when they walk down the street they're white, they've benefited from the white power structures that upholds the racism and the systemic racism here in this country. And for that reason, because they're able to pose as white and because they're able to pass as white, they benefit from all of that. And then an added dimension is Israel. Israel on the left is attacked as an extension of white colonialism and apartheid and settlers, and Jews who support Israel therefore support colonialism and extremism. And in this view, the Palestinians are people of color, and the Israelis, and by extension American Jews who support the Israelis, are white, regardless of the fact that more than half the population of Israel is not of European descent; it's of Middle Eastern descent. But we don't have to get too far into that. But what we're faced with then is these two extremes. Where on the right rejects us as being part of the white people, and the left insists that actually we are part of the white structure. When we get into how Jews answer the question, or how Jews view themselves, it gets very complicated. But historically, as I say, Jews rejected the idea. Jews always were very uncomfortable with the idea that they were white. Yet at the same time, they understood that they really benefited from having white skin and presenting as white. As I said, they avoided a lot of the racial laws that didn't apply to them because they appeared to have white skin. Immigrants were more or less able to fairly quickly integrate into American society. As a minority group, Jews have done extraordinarily well. In some ways, better than any other minority group here in the United States in terms of access to education, access to wealth and prosperity, political power. Jews are overrepresented in Congress and in a lot of other institutions. Yet Jews said, well, sure, but at the same time, look, they were speaking Yiddish, and they lived in sort of their own neighborhoods and their own enclaves, and sometimes their own whole parts of town. They were still excluded from certain areas, of course, from colleges and universities and country clubs, and at the end of the day, there was still anti-Semitism that they faced, and Jews would say, well, the racial laws didn't apply to us, but the anti-immigration laws, which were racist, did. So the immigration laws that restricted Jewish immigration at various times in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So it's always been kind of this back and forth of Jews, looking at ourselves, well, am I white, am I not white, and kind of wrestling with that. Which brings me back to the question, do Jews benefit from white supremacy? It's a little bit of an unfair question, or maybe a better way to put it is it's a little bit of a red herring, because in this whole discussion, historically, what has been left out of course, are Jews who are not white, are Jews of color, or we call them diverse Jews. And I'm going to hand off to Sean in a few minutes, and he'll go into it more. But of course, we have this Jewish population that does not identify as white and can't even pass as white because they're not white. And so this question of, well, do we benefit from white, from white supremacy, is really a question that only can be asked of Jews of European heritage, primarily Ashkenazi Jews, which isn't to say that there are Jews of color who are not Ashkenazi Jews, because there are. But what tends to get left out of the discussion, and the question is, well, what about Jews of color? And what role are they playing? And of course, the answer for them is, well, of course they don't benefit from white supremacy. In fact, just the opposite. They have to navigate the world both as people of color, but also as Jews. And so historically, the Jewish community, we haven't been great about including Jews of color, or trying to understand where they're coming from or what their experiences are, and therefore really fully accepting them into the communities. You'll see this term Ashkenormative. So literally, like maybe an hour and a half ago, as I was working on this, I opened up my Instagram, and this was the very first thing on my Instagram, like an hour and a half ago. And I was like, wow, it's just so perfect, I have to include it. I don't know who this person is. It's just popped up on my Instagram. But she put, Sephardic Jews, we got to speak up more about being Sephardic. I'm sick of people thinking my family eats gefilte fish. So yeah. So it's perfect. It's a perfect illustration. You'll see this term tossed around a lot now, Ashkenormative, and it's just a combination of the word Ashkenazi and normal, and it's the suggestion that the Ashkenazi way of being Jewish is the default, and then there's Ashkenazi, and there's sort of everyone else and everything else, and that has been decades or even a century in the making here in the United States. For the last 100 years, the Jewish establishment, the big Jewish organizations, the federations, the JCCs, the big national organizations, even synagogues, really have been dominated by Ashkenazi Jews. And because of that, it's just the classic Ashkenazi Jews created the structures and the lifestyles and the organizations that fit their needs, and did not, by and large, consider the needs of those who were not Ashkenazi, or who do not look like them. And so what we find ourselves now in is a Jewish world, a Jewish community here in the United States that is Ashkenormative. And let me give you a few examples. So one that you'll find is the centrality of Holocaust commemoration. By the way, let me just say, I'm not suggesting that any of this is bad, or should be done less, or is critical in any way. This is all, positive things. I'm just calling out some of the ways that we might not be thinking about how this is impacting other people. But if you look at the centrality of Holocaust commemoration, and Yom HaShoah is coming up. Ashkenazi Jews obviously have the Holocaust as an enormously central aspect of their identity, and as an event that occurred in the lifetime of people who are still alive. But we tend to forget that there are lots of Jews who did not experience the Holocaust. Jews that are from the Middle East and North Africa, or from India or Ethiopia or Latin America, other places, they didn't have the Holocaust. And so for them, it's not that they don't care about the Holocaust, it's just not as central to their identity as other things are. So for example, every Jewish organization, and I'm starting to get the emails now because Yom HaShoah is coming up next month, every Jewish organization does something around Holocaust commemoration, and there's events happening and speakers and candle lighting, and there's all kinds of commemorative events that happen. I can't think of any established Jewish organization that I have seen that commemorates the Farhud massacre in Baghdad in 1941 against Iraqi Jews, or the destruction of the Jewish quarter of Aden in Yemen in 1947, or the expulsion of 1 million Jews from the Middle East and North Africa in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s in response to the creation of Israel. And if you ask Mizrahi Jews, who are Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, or Sephardi Jews, or other Jews who aren't Ashkenazi, those events are huge, and especially for Mizrahi Jews. You know, my family, I'm Ashkenazi. I ended up here in America because of the Holocaust. Well, if you ask Mizrahi Jews, how did they end up here in America, or most of them are in Israel? Well, the answer is the expulsions and the pogroms that they faced in the Arab world. And those are events that tend to not get much attention, and we don't know that much about them, and they don't get commemorated or recognized in the same way that the Holocaust does. So another event is highlighted by the Instagram is food. Chicken soup is a Jewish food. Everybody knows this, right? Well, it is for Ashkenazi Jews. Jews from the Middle East and North Africa didn't necessarily grow up with chicken soup. They had other soups, and they have other foods. It was Purim a few weeks ago. I was putting together a newsletter of things relating to Purim, and I was getting tons and tons of recipe suggestions for hamantashen, the cookies. How do you make hamantashen? This way, that way, and tons of recipes. And I went looking for, well, what about Sephardi foods, or what about Mizrahi foods for Purim? What do Mizrahi Jews from the Middle East for Purim? And it was a lot harder to find stuff. And it turns out their history isn't hamantashen. They use chickpeas, and you make all kinds of desserts and other foods using chickpeas as sort of their traditional food. And of course, I didn't know that. So we're talking very, very, very different foods. Sephardic Jews, this Instagram, I'm sick of people making my family eats gefilte fish. And finally, just the Jewish history that we study, the texts that we study, they tend to be very European centric, very Ashkenazi centric, and part of that is for good reasons. Some of the great scholars and philosophers, of course, came out of Europe, and so it is correct and right that we study them. But there are also lots of scholars and philosophers who came out of the Arab world who we don't study, and I never learned about them, and I still don't know very much about them. But you will find philosophers right up there with the Maimonides and the Rashis and the other ones who came out of the Iraqi Jewish community, which has been in place for 2,500 years, or the Ethiopian Jewish community, which has also been around for maybe even longer than that, 2,800 years. And so we really leave out whole other aspects of Judaism when we just focus on the Ashkenazi things that we're familiar with. And at the same time, I'll sort of say one other thing about this, and then I'm going to toss it over to you, Sean. I also do want to resist the idea that you have Ashkenazi Jews and then you have everybody else. Actually this morning, a friend of mine got married on Zoom, and so I was at her wedding, and her now husband is white. He's an Ashkenazi Jew. She is Chinese Jewish. She's an Asian American. She's Chinese and she's Jewish. I actually don't know how she would identify. Probably she would identify as Ashkenazi because I think one of her parents is Ashkenazi. I'm not 100% sure, but either way, I don't want to suggest there's Ashkenazi and then there's Jews of color, and these are two separate people. You can certainly have Jews of color who are also Ashkenazi. And it doesn't have to be this strict separation. And I think that's really important. And that goes to the idea that Ashkenazi white Jews are the default, that's the normal, and then there's Jews of color who is a completely different category. Because at the end of the day, going back to the book of Exodus, or even just going back to the archaeological history that we have of the Jewish people and the early Israelites, and going back 3,000 years, we have always been multiracial, multi-ethnic, multinational people, coming from all kinds of historical backgrounds: Jews of Europe, Jews of the Middle East, Jews from Latin America, Jews from Africa, Jews from Asia. And there's all these different experiences and all these different ethnicities and nationalities contained in that. And, it's really important now, I think, important and correct that we're doing the work to ensure that within our community, everyone's Jewish. When they walk into synagogue, everyone's a Jew, and to resist pushing labels on people, and even when we mean well, and I don't want to steal the thunder from speakers next week and afterwards, but my friend that got married this morning, who's Chinese, she will tell you how many times she gets asked when she walks into a Jewish space, well, where are you really from? And are you sure are you really Jewish? And well, how did you end up, well, and she gets quizzed about, how are you Jewish? Is your mother Jewish? Well, did you convert? Well, when did you convert? Which are questions that, of course, I never get asked. So those are just a few ideas to throw out there, which we can then discuss and come back to later. But I will end my screen share here and turn it over to John.
Thank you, Jackson. Well said, as always. All right, so I'll share out my screen here, and I'll also say hello, good afternoon, and a belated Shabbat Shalom to everyone. So although Jeff gave a wonderful introduction to the both of us, I'll do a brief overview about myself and jump into my portion. So yeah, I'm 33 years old, and I am a member of Temple Sinai, Oakland. I'm originally from Winston-Salem, North Carolina. I grew up in a Baptist family, but around the time of 15, when I was 15 years old, I started to identify as a very out and proud atheist. And that went on for the next 10 to 12 years, up until I met my fiance, Amy. Now, Amy herself grew up in a Jewish family, and she has some very strong connections and ties to her identity. But with Amy was like, outside of my adventures in Florida, of course, but Amy was really my first exposure to Jewish culture and Shabbat. So with Amy, we were part of a couple of Jewish youth groups, both in Asheville, North Carolina, as well as in Durham, North Carolina. And we went to, several Shabbat style potlucks. I had the opportunity to attend a 7-day what Kabbalah workshop, or intro to Kabbalah workshop, as well as a once a week Torah portion conversation groups that we had with different rabbis within our community. And when the both of us moved to Oakland, and I'm getting my years mixed up, but I want to say back in 2018, we became members of Temple Sinai, Oakland. And then a year later, I decided to convert through the Reform movement, as you can see with our rabbis from our temple. That's Rabbi Mates Muchin on our left, and to the right is Rabbi Regev and our Cantor Keys. So other than being a member of the Temple Sinai community, according to a 2017 study, I am also part of the 12% of the US Jewish population who identifies as a Jew of color. And I'm part of the 17% of the Jewish population who consider themselves, or a person of color who is also a Jew in the Bay Area. Now, the data that I'll be referencing today is from a partnership between the Jews of Color Field Building Initiative and the concentration in education and Jewish studies at the Stanford Graduate School of Education, as well as the SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice at the University of San Francisco. So um, I'm gonna have several questions to get the conversation going and to really connect my part of the presentation. So my first question is, what is white? So the words race, white, and even slave to an extent were words already used in several European languages, but they took on a new meaning as these European countries began to settle in the Americas. Now, when English society first made contact with indigenous populations of the Caribbean, they began to differentiate themselves in part as a means of justification for colonization. Um, White, as we know it today, the term was first used, or is known to be first used as early as the 1550s to describe English women and describe a person of high class who did not need to go outside for labor. The identifier of white expanded to Anglo-Saxon men and beyond as a means to suppress immigrant populations and emancipated slaves, finding common cause to push back against the gentry. So if you're ever familiar with the part of American history where there's a bit of an overlap between African slaves and, for example, Irish indentured servants, what a lot of the aristocracy started to realize was these two groups are getting along, and that's not good. So what began happening was a lot of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants in America who owned land and slaves, as well as hired indentured servants, began to give Irish immigrants more privileges to kind of develop this wedge between African slaves and Irish immigrants. And so we see a lot of people of Irish descent become slave drivers and later on law enforcement officers. And that's a bit of the origin of that. So who and who isn't white changes depending on how it benefits white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Everyone in America superficially benefits to varying degrees from white supremacy, but it ultimately hurts us all. And so today, one thing I wanted to touch on is the three forms of racism that are outlined by Angela Davis's younger sister, Fania E. Davis, in her book, Race and Restorative Justice. So those three forms that I want to briefly cover are structural racism, institutional racism, and individual. And just like Jason had posited a moment ago, I'll be asking the question in a slightly different way. But of the three forms of racism that we'll be covering, which one have you witnessed or benefit from in your own life? So let's take structural racism, for example. So to define structural racism, it refers to how racism is interwoven into society and our cultural identity. The way that people of color are depicted in the media and what is taught in our schools regarding American history are heavily impacted by this form. So if you think of the companies, especially in Texas, that they determine what goes into a school textbook, what does not, and what gets edited down. This is a form of structural racism because there's a big push to rewrite the cause of the Civil War. As many of you have maybe heard in other conversations, I definitely heard it when I was in high school that for the Confederate States, the Civil War started because these Confederate states were fighting for states' rights. And honestly, all you got to do is ask the follow up question, the states' right of what? And the whole argument falls apart. But you run into those kind of issues, and you run into another issue where a lot of former Confederate states and people who really identify with that region and that culture will try to play down slavery and how slaves were treated in particular areas of the South, as to say, well, you know, maybe slavery wasn't that bad. Um, Not only does it hurt people of color, but it also, as we can tell, it hurts Jewish Americans as well. A couple of illustrations that I decided to show today are from Jack Chick. If anybody's familiar with that name, he's no longer alive, but these comic strips that he put out are going strong. And so Jack Chick was this comic book artist who put out a lot of these tiny comic strips that are pro-white Christian America. And it really gets into everybody's head that, if you're not white and you're not a Christian, then you are on the wrong side of history and you are on the wrong side of what's going to happen in the end of days. And the Jack Chick was not shy about, really propagating these negative stereotypes about Jews and people of color as well. The next type of racism I want to cover real quick is institutional racism. Go to my notes here. So institutional racism is racism that is codified in our laws in both public and private institutions, which created to suppress communities of color while benefiting whites. So some primary examples that I can uphold are the Jim Crow laws of the South, redlining, which limited the types of homes and neighborhoods that people of color could live in, and severely limited which banks would offer them loans at or mortgage loans at what rate, as well as incarceration rates, where we see Black and brown people who are 20% of the general population, but make up about 60% of the prison population. And here's my favorite. So the third type of racism I want to make sure we cover, which I feel like is going to come up a lot during your sessions this week and next week, is individual racism. So individual racism refers to our internalized bias favoring Western beauty standards over others and reinforcing a quote unquote proper way to speak English and carry ourselves in the world. So I wanted to stop at individual racism because this is where we get into microaggressions. And it sounds like you folks will also be going into a deeper dive of microaggressions next week. But I thought the least I could do was share a few personal antidotes, excuse me, in regards to microaggressions. And I know Jason had did just a moment ago. But personal story, the last Yom Kippur breakfast that I attended before COVID was at a friend's house, and I was maybe the only person of color there. Everybody else was white appearing or of Ashkenazi, excuse me, descent. And the woman next to me started to ask me all these very uncomfortable questions regarding my conversion and whether or not that was legitimate and what were my reasons for converting. And I found those questions to be very uncomfortable, but I had a very difficult time exiting the conversation, other than the food being fantastic. And that was in comparison to someone else there who was just beginning their road to conversion. She was an older white woman, and everybody applauded her for taking this step, but no one had really asked her or scrutinized her reasons for converting. Um, that same year, during services for Yom Kippur, my partner and I and a couple of our friends, we rode together to a temple, and we all had our tickets for the services. And so there were a few volunteers at the door. Um, we walked 2 services in a crowd. I was in the back of the crowd. And my partner and her friends, they were waved through the door without, a second thought. And then when I got to the door, I got stopped. My partner had my tickets, but I was questioned as to who I was, why I was there, do I understand what Yom Kippur is, things of that nature. And again, it was it was very uncomfortable, and I found myself, giving all my Jew credentials just so I can attend Yom Kippur. Um, this also happened more than once, either for a Saturday morning Torah study or for Friday night services, where after the incident in Pittsburgh, we as a congregation agreed that it would be in everyone's best interest if we had extra security at the door. Everybody was fine with that. But what started happening was on First Friday services, where we were members of the congregation can bring in instruments and sing and play along during services. I had this huge accordion case that doubles as a backpack, so I was carrying that. And on more than one occasion, I got stopped at the door so the security could check my backpack. However, while this is going on, several other white appearing people who are also members of the congregation were not stopped or scrutinized. Outside of that, just journal stuff that I'm sure well, I know I'm not the only person this happens to, but being complimented for how I talk or how I carry myself, or being told I'm one of the good ones, are also examples of individual racism as well as microaggression. And it goes both ways, because just, being an African American, you know what you can and cannot do in this country and what will and will not get you arrested. So you learn at a very early age how to survive in America. And part of that is complying to norms set by white supremacy, and in some way either shedding or suppressing your ethnic identity. And so again, here are the 3 forms if anybody wants to look over those before we begin our conversation. But one more thing I want to reiterate is this, and that is the most dangerous element of white supremacy, and I'm using white supremacy and racism interchangeably here, is how pervasive it is, y'all. Although we may succeed in addressing at least one of these 3 aspects of racism or white supremacy, there are multiple other arenas where it manifests. And so, in regards to my data, there were a few problematic things as well. So, American Jewish population studies have neglected to systematically and consistently ask about the racial and ethnic identities of American Jews. The result has been that we know little about the composition and size of the population of Jews of color. This has been due in part to the working assumption that the vast majority of American Jewish identity is white. However, here's the interesting news. Since 1930s, the number of people of color who are born into Jewish families has increased by 25%. So on some superficial level, we are seeing more and more Jews of color be just present in our general populations. American Jewish population studies have neglected to systematically and consistently ask about the racial. I already read that part. Sorry, y'all. But again, the way we count does and does not count. So 12% of Jewish households include non-white and multiracial members. However, 65% of the people living in multiracial households are under 45 years of age. That's at least true for residents in New York since 2011. For where Jason and I live in the Bay Area, 25% of Jewish households include non-white and multiracial members, and 65% of the people living in multiracial households are under the age of 49. 38% are under the age of 35. So here's my closing question, and we can get to the fun part. How does knowing there are Jews of color in America impact your life? And I'll unshare my screen for this part.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. So we're happy to open up to questions, discussions, anything, and I'll let Jeff or somebody manage that.
I think we'll start with asking everyone to put questions in the chat box or comments in the chat box. And I think Rabbi Myra is going to field the questions and kind of batch the ones that should go together.
So far, we don't have any questions. I can't believe it. What's going on with this crowd? So I wonder, we asked for questions in the chat because we've got a lot of people on this call. And we thought that would sort of keep things in order, but I don't know if that's stifling questions and we should just open it up or what.
I have a question for Jason and Sean, and Myra might know the answer, about the percentages of people of color in Israel, Jews of color in Israel, what those numbers are right now.
Well, it's hard to get an exact number. More, right about 50%. I think it's a little bit more now of Jews in Israel are Mizrahi, so they're coming from the Middle East and North Africa, not of European descent. How that then breaks down, that I don't know, but for sure, Ashkenazi Jews are now in the minority in Israel, although they're still the majority. They're still the majority in political power and the upper ranks of the army and other major institutions. But yeah, it's one of the things, one of the funny things that happens when I was leading birthright trips to Israel with young adults, teenagers, and 20 somethings as we go, and inevitably we'd be there and be a couple of days in, and somebody would remark like, "Wow, like this place just feels like so Middle Eastern," and I would always laugh, and then our tour guide would always be like, "Well, where'd you think you were?" And somebody would say, "I don't know, I sort of thought it'd be like Los Angeles or something," and so it's like, well, yeah, Israel is a Middle Eastern country, and now most of the people that live there are Middle Eastern, and of course. That's just the Jews. Of course, 20% of Israel are Arabs. They're Arab Israelis. They're definitely not from Europe. They're indigenous. So Israel's a Middle Eastern country, and most Jews there are not white.
Okay, we're getting some questions now. One thing I want Sean to let you know is we got one answer to your question, which was that knowing that there are more Jews of color than I thought, this person said, is enriching and makes me feel happy, good. But one question we got that I think probably speaks to a broader, and maybe you all can kind of figure out the broader question in here, but I suspect there's a broader question, but it'll do as it is. Why use the term white supremacy, which connotes right-wing racism, rather than something like white predominance, which I imagine feels a little less in your face to the questioner?
Thank you for that question, Murray. I use the term white supremacy because I don't want to marry it just to right-wing ideology, because we see a little bit of white supremacy that even pervades left-leaning ideologies in a way where sometimes the agenda for equality ultimately benefits whites while it leaves people of color and people with particular disabilities on the back burner. And again, I don't know if I really illustrated it earlier, but white supremacy is less of a conservative ideology issue and more of an American cultural issue.
There's another question that kind of ties into Jeffrey's, which was whether or not the historical events of Mizrahi and Sephardic Jews are commemorated in Israel. I think they're not, but any of you know differently?
Yeah, they're, it's something that's changing, but historically, no. I mean, this has been part of the problem. Israel's a whole different discussion, but there you do have similar forces at work. I mean, Ashkenazi Jews were the majority in Israel for the first 10, 20 years, maybe of Israel's existence. And as I said, still now, but especially back then, they really dominated the government, the army, education, the higher institutions of Israel. And they were very focused, Zionism was very focused on the European Jewish experience. And so Mizrahi Jews, although they are the majority of Israel, they are often looked down upon. They less access to education, less access to healthcare, less access to the prosperous jobs. They live in poor cities. Generally speaking, they do worse off than Ashkenazi Jews in Israel. And part and parcel of that is that the state has not been good historically in recognizing Mizrahi culture and recognizing major historical milestones. But I think that's changing a lot.
Another question we had was how, and I would love to hear from both of you on this, how can synagogues find and use the data from the various studies that you shared with us?
I was wondering that myself. I'm curious what this congregation ultimately wants to do after these 3 sessions. Is the goal to be more inclusive to your members of color? Is your goal to do more outreach within Reno and the greater community? Is the goal to seek more equity in Reno? So I'll guess I'll answer that question with another question.
Good. I don't think we know the answers to that. I mean, this is just a starting point.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. I think you're going to have to listen to the Jews of color, who I think are going to speak in a couple of weeks, and to others in the community who have a stake in this. I don't know that you're going to be able to come up with the answer just on your own. I think you're going to have to learn from the people who want to be in the community but don't feel, haven't always felt welcomed. And that I think will help you figure out exactly what needs to be changed.
Right. And there's a similar question about some first steps that we could take to make our synagogue a place where all Jews feel they belong, and I think we ought to ask that.
I think it would be a good idea to have a series of 3 panels addressing this topic and have Jason and myself come on to begin.
Yeah. Okay.
I say that to say I think you're taking the first steps right now.
And a similar one asking about if there's ways to hold our synagogue leaders to account for the types of microaggressions experienced by our members and visitors of color. And we're going to talk a lot about microaggressions next week, so maybe that's the place to work on that. Let me see what else. Did I miss things? I have a question that I think goes in here. Here's one. This questioner says, I've heard it said that slavery is America's original sin. Could the early Jewish inhabitants of New York tenements be considered enslaved in some way?
Sure. Again, we all benefit and we all suffer from white supremacy. Any marginalized group in America has their own story and their own journey towards equity. I will say that this story can count as well, and I would hope that it doesn't, what's the best word I'm looking for? I hope it doesn't detract from the stories of indigenous people in America, of descendants of slaves, and any other immigrant population in America who, again, is struggling to, live a fulfilling and peaceful life.
Yeah, I have a slightly different answer, which is I was just talking to I was exchanged message in the chat about Mark Dollinger, who's a professor at SF State here in the Bay Area. And if you have not written his book, Black Power, Jewish Politics, you should. It's really excellent, really thought provoking. And I've heard him now tell the story several times, and it's really relevant, I think, for Passover. And this gets to the question about tenements is, what happened. Mark Dollinger quotes from a friend of his who's Black, not Jewish, and who tells Professor Dollinger, if one more Jewish person tells me that they know what it's like to be oppressed because they too were slaves in Egypt, I'm going to lose it. And so I want to be careful when we try to equate our historical experiences with the experiences of slavery here in the United States. The tenement experience was its own experience, and it has its positives and it's had a lot of negatives. And certainly the case can be made for Jews, pushed into tenements or in other ways relegated to bad parts of town or to their own neighborhoods, that they were experiencing certain racism or anti-Semitism. But I always want us to be careful about saying like, oh yeah, so we totally know what it's like. And because sometimes we use that answer, or we use that, we also had, we also were persecuted and we've been oppressed. Therefore, like, we're not a part of this racism thing, and we're not going back to the white supremacy or white power, however we're not a part of this. I don't have to worry about this. This doesn't apply to me. When in fact, that's not the case. So I'm always careful about saying, oh yeah, it was very similar.
And I want to add to that what Geraldo put in the chat for presumably everyone has seen, that chattel slavery is a specific thing and everything else is best described as labor exploitation. And we want to be careful, as Jason made the point. And I want to sort of dovetail, Jason, on the last thing that you said. Every time I've been a part of any of these conversations, what somebody will bring up, so I'll bring it up, the issue of, as Jews, if we're trying to be people who are anti-racist, what do we do when we run into anti-Semitism among those folks that we think we're in that same anti-racist enterprise with? And then there they are being anti-Semitic, and we as Jews are feeling like, yipes, we wanted to do this and we wanted to do this, but we're being the object of discrimination. I've worked out my answer, but I wonder what you all guys would say.
So I'm making sure I hear the question right. So how do we address anti-racism when we also experience anti-Semitism?
When we're trying to address anti-racism, yes. From the very folks that we think we're allied with in the anti-racist fight, who are then running anti-Semitism on us.
All right. So, I mean, we're both in the same boat, right? I feel like we can multitask and shut that down right away. And my first inclination is, where do you draw the line in tolerating racism in the fight for anti-Semitism? And is there a line?
Where I hear it the most is when somebody gets involved arguing that Black Lives Matter is anti-Semitic, so we can't be a part of that. That's usually,
of course. Well, you can be a part of Black Lives Matter. There may be I wouldn't want to say members. There may be people who associate themselves with Black Lives Matter that may also hold some anti-Semitic ideologies. If you want to shut that down with all the authority that I have of me, feel free to do so right ahead. But between communities, whatever the marginalized community in America is, you have more in common than you have not in common. And I think part of the anti-Semitism you may get from members who associate themselves with the Black Lives Matter community is this public facing view of Jews in America who, whether intentionally or unintentionally, have aligned themselves with white supremacy. And so in order to shut that down, there's going to have to be some really uncomfortable conversations and moves to disassociate yourself with white supremacy.
There's also a question about whether synagogues have equity and diversity committees.
I hope so.
As far as I know, very few, but there are starting to be some where that is the case. And Jeff posed an interesting question, and it's an interesting way to ask what we've heard today. Are some Jews anti-Semitic? Well, yeah, we know they are. But what Jeff is asking is, if a Jew is Ashkenazic and feels that they are the Jew and that others are less so or not really Jewish at all, it's an interesting kind of, it's a bizarre form of anti-Semitism within our own community. I think that's where Jeff's question was going, yeah? Yeah. Okay, I think I've pretty much gone through them all.
There was a question about monuments that I wanted.
Thank you.
I don't know if you guys know, I'm a leading authority on monuments. I want to get back to the question if I can find it.
Find it.
Here it is.
Okay,
I'll read it out loud.
Are you curious about how you view taking down of monuments and the Dr. Seuss Enterprises banning certain books? Or are you in favor of this, or would you rather these be used as teaching moments, etc.?
To answer the first part of the question, I am pro taking down monuments. I think Germany after World War II had the right idea. However, there is a place for these things. You can either ground them up and make a sidewalk with it, or you can have it in a museum where, you know, in a place where we learn from our past and, teach future generations of, this is the way life was, and we are striving to do better than what we came from. The issue I take with monuments in public places is it really romanticizes a past that didn't necessarily existed, and that it pushes an agenda that I will hope to feel that collectively we do not necessarily agree with. And I mean, I don't give any slack to Dr. Seuss either. If he put out anything that's racist or anti-Semitic, then he has no place on the bookshelf. And this is another thing that perhaps we need to put in a museum.
Okay, I hope.
Yeah, I would add to that. I mean, so you may be aware one of the controversial things that's been going on in San Francisco the past few months, because as if we needed more, was that the Department of Education sort of embarked on this effort to rename dozens of schools in San Francisco because people objected to the current names as being about white supremacy or having committed crime or crimes against humanity, things like that. So San Francisco has been looking at changing all these names, like Lincoln and Washington and Dianne Feinstein, our senator, and Paul Revere, and people have been very upset about it. And it was very clear that the process by which it was done, it's now been put on hold. I just saw an article. They've decided they have too much else going on with trying to reopen schools to deal with now changing all their names. But it was really, it really raises this question of like, well, what do you keep and what do you not? And where you have schools or other things named after people that most of the country sees heroically, like a Lincoln or a Washington, or that indisputably did really great and wonderful things, but for some other people also have this really negative connotation. And my I sort of said jokingly when this is going on, I said, okay, well, great. Well, if they're going to change all the names from Lincoln and Washington, then are they going to go around changing all the Christian schools' names around here too? Because every single saint, whoever that the schools around here are named for, they were all, horribly anti-Semitic, and certainly had no love for the Jews. And in some case, some of these saints that these schools are named after, instigated violence against Jewish communities and massacres against Jewish communities. And so, yeah, I think it's these are, I don't think they're difficult questions, but I also do think we're at a point where, yeah, if these Dr. Seuss books are overtly racist, we don't need them, and we don't need to be teaching our children this kinds of stuff.
Yeah, I'm getting messages that my mic is fuzzy, for which I have to apologize and have no idea what to do. Thank you all for the questions. I know that we barely, we're barely scratching the surface of anything, and in that case, it's a little frustrating, but we meant this just to be a starting conversation, and there will be 2 more weeks continuing the conversation, and then we'll see what else where we go and what we can do. Thank you, Sean and Jason. Both, and
Jason, would you spend a few seconds talking about Jew Ought to Know, so people know what that is?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for reminding me. So Jew Ought to Know is a podcast on Jewish and Israeli history, started about 4 years or so ago. It really came out of a place of I was leading trips to Israel for Birthright for young adults, and I would get lots of questions from them about Jewish history and other things, and I never had time to answer them all. And so I had the idea of just starting a podcast where I was going to go through Jewish history from the beginning to the end, answering any question that I've ever been asked. And I started doing that, and then it kind of took on a life of its own. So yeah, Jew Ought to Know is really getting at most Jews don't know Jewish history, or we just know the basics and Israeli history as well, and we just know sort of a little bit on the surface. And I really wanted to provide a forum for people to go and learn about Jewish and Israeli history in a way that I hope is interesting and kind of fun and informative. And it's this podcast. So I've done 4 seasons so far. I have a 5th one that I'm going to be launching in just a couple of weeks, just wrapping up some things with it now. This next season is going to be starting probably right around Passover. It's going to be on ancient Jewish history, the first 1,000 years or so. So it'll be, if you've ever wondered why Jerusalem is so important, and what about the temples, and who was King David, and where did God come from, and where do the Israelites come from, I'll be talking about all those things. So yeah, thank you. And I'll post in the chat here my email. If you want to keep talking about this stuff, feel free to email me. And thanks for having me. Thanks for having us.
Very good. I want to thank everybody for participating. And
can I next week, the microaggressions, Nicole Jacobs is on with us today. She's not only going to talk about what they are, but she's going to give us a kind of a toolkit for if you are doing them or are the object of them or a bystander to microaggressions, what do you do? So I think it's going to be a pretty intense kind of a lot of, technical kinds of stuff, hands-on, what can you do stuff. And you'll notice in the resources, there are a couple things that Nicole would love for us to have read before the session, if you get the chance. And absolutely, let's take this conversation offline to Jason or Jeff or me or one another or everybody. And thank you so much, Sean and Jason. Yeah. And Jeff, you want to send us out of here?
Yeah, I was just going to say thank you all for attending, but mostly thanks to Jason and Sean for taking the time to prepare and to come to Reno and to give us lots and lots to think about. The idea, as Myra was saying, is for us to become aware and sensitized and sensitive, and then as a community to kind of go forward and build on what we're learning here, to make ourselves more welcoming and more warm and more accepting and more knowledgeable in all these areas. So thank you all so much.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.
You gonna end us, Jeff?
Mhm.